Text Analysis, Totem and War by Andrew Liu. Totem by Thomas King. Setting and plot. Totem takes place in the Southwest Alberta Art Gallery and Prairie Museum. The story starts with B.B. Hill's complaint about a totem pole making unusual noises in the museum. Despite efforts to remove it, the totem pole remains, emitting stronger voices as the museum used increasingly harsh methods to treat it, initially gargling, then chuckling and grunting, and eventually escalating to shouting and singing when cut with a chainsaw. The museum staff, unable to find a solution, reluctantly accepts its presence and gradually gets used to the sounds. Conflict. The story revolves around the conflict between the Indigenous community of southern Alberta and the Canadian government. The museum director and staff represents the government, while the totem poles in the museum are symbolic of the Indigenous community. The story highlights the struggle faced by the Indigenous people and their forced relocation to reserves. Literary devices. The first one is symbol. The totem is mentioned 21 times, symbolizing the enduring presence of Indigenous people in the modern world. And the museum is a symbol that represents the dominance of Westerners on the land of Canada. Simile, like living next to the train tracks or by a highway. This sentence draws a comparison between the totem sound and a train track or highway. Both highways and trains are commonly considered noisy, highlighting how the Western perspective tends to undervalue Indigenous sounds. The third one is personification. The chain screaming, emphasizing the loud and intense noise it creates while cutting the totem pole, demonstrates the Westerner's double standard in generating loud noises while prohibiting others from making sound. Additionally, it showcases the barbaric nature of their use of such an aggressive tool to cut the totem pole. The next device is diction. The museum staff uses words like problem, annoying, and disgusting to describe the totem. Through these word choices, the author characterizes the staff as having a negative view of the totem. Contrast. At the beginning, Walter says we can't have it making noises, but at the end, after deciding to leave the totem alone, he hardly noticed it at all. This shift in attitude contrasts the initial disturbance caused by the sounds with the eventual normalization of the totem pole's presence. It shows that Indigenous culture will inevitably permeate the everyday lives of those who may have little idea of its significance. Personal reaction and response. I can resonate with the feeling of having one's voice undervalued or entirely ignored. In my younger years, elders often perceived me as knowing nothing, and my genuine thoughts were frequently dismissed by my parents or other elders. It's a sentiment that evokes a strong desire to shout out loud, to be heard or recognized. Connection to status quo. The story symbolically critiques Canadian colonization and the challenges confronted by the Indigenous people. It illustrates how colonization perpetuates racist attitudes toward the Indigenous population. King is trying to bring attention to the oppression faced by the Indigenous people and urges a shift in the status quo to pursue greater equal rights for them. War by Lee Maracle. Lee Maracle is a Canadian author of Salish and Cree ancestry. The poem was published in the year of 2000. War describes the experience of Indigenous people in post-colonial Canada, examining the turmoil and injustice faced by the Indigenous peoples in the past. The poem presents the feelings of pain and love as non-conflicting. As such, Maracle writes of the necessary acceptance and strength for Indigenous people to take back the narrative. Rhyme and rhythm. The poem is composed of short fragmented lines that create a sense of urgency and fracture. The poem's structure reflects the chaos and violence in war, as well as the speaker's struggle to find meaning and hope in the midst of conflict. Literary devices. Metaphor. In my body flows the blood of Gallic Bastille swarmers and the soft, gentle ways of Salish Cree womanhood. Maracle utilizes metaphor to draw a comparison between her ancestry and the blood coursing through her veins. This line highlights the speaker's mixed heritage and the different culture traditions that have come together to form her identity. Allusion. The reference to Gallic Bastille stormers alludes to the French Revolution's storming of the Bastille, symbolizing courage and revolutionary spirit. The author uses this allusion to convey her bravery and commitment in reclaiming the indigenous narrative. Rhetorical question: can I deny a heritage blackened by the toil of billions, conceived in rape, plunder, and butchery? This rhetorical question prompts reflection on the historical injustice embedded in the European colonization history. Diction: the author employs the device of diction to directly address European thief, liar, bloodsucker, showcasing her condemnation of colonial history. Enjambment between I ascribe and to my people, where sentence carries over from one line to the next without a pause or punctuation, creates a sense of continuity and connection between ideas expressed, emphasizing the interconnectedness of speaker's commitment to broader humanity and her specific dedication to indigenous people and history. Personal reaction and response. I am deeply touched by these lines. I am moved by my love for human life, by the firm conviction that all the world must stop the butchery, stop the slaughter. Since watching Schindler's List, I have learned about the brutality of war, and I feel sorrow for the lives lost in conflicts. Currently, the world is amidst Russo-Ukrainian war and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with people dying every day. I too yearn for the world to cease the butchery and halt the slaughter. Connection to status quo. War is a powerful expression of resistance, a refusal to accept the status quo defined by historical injustice, and a plea to halt the oppression of indigenous people and cease the slaughter of all. It calls for an end to violence and a collective re-evaluation of the historical narratives that perpetuate oppression, aiming for a more compassionate and just world. Connection and difference. Regarding connection, they're connected in three ways. First, they're both exploration of indigenous experiences. Both War and Totem dive into the experience of indigenous people in Canada, shedding light on their struggles, challenges, and injustice they faced. Second is that they have a common theme. Both works share a common theme of highlighting the importance of understanding and respecting indigenous culture and history. They emphasize the need for acknowledgement and empathy towards the indigenous community. Third is that they're both pushing against the status quo, asking for changes. Regarding differences, the first is that they have different focus of critiques. War serves as a critique of colonization and reconciliation with the dark colonial history, while Totem is critiquing the Canadian government's policy of suppressing indigenous voices and forcing them to relocate to reserves. The second is they have different genres. War is a poem using emotional language and poetic devices to convey the pain and suffer of indigenous people. Totem is a short story that relies on symbolism to convey a metaphor through the narrative. The third is the narrative approach. War is using direct approach, just narrating the struggles and challenges faced by indigenous people, while Totem is more of a symbolic approach, using symbols like totem, museum, director, and art to critique the Canadian colonization. And that's all for the presentation. Thanks for listening.